Noe, are you doing class today?
Yes.
Okay, I think we're ready. Okay, okay, everybody. For those of you that are at home, we're doing the California Purchase Agreement, and we were on page 2, and I think we finished the other day by doing page 2, item K, buyer stated financing, and we had talked about how important it is for a buyer to be forthright in the purchase agreement about the kind of financing that they're getting, and not to use a phrase, change horses midstream, because the seller can say that they don't agree with that and back out of the purchase agreement. So that's what item K is about. Number 4 is sale of buyer's property. A lot of times buyers can't buy a property unless they sell a property. And we have a number of transactions like that all the time where a buyer has to sell something. And there's a form that we use called the COP, contingent on purchase. And it sets the parameters of what the seller is willing to do to wait for the buyer to sell their property. And it gives information to the seller if the buyer is already in escrow, if the property's listed. And it also talks about how long that seller is willing to wait for that to happen. So that form is very important. And if there is a contingency, you need to be sure to disclose that. I think we talked in class the other day, I gave an example of an agent who had buyers, and she didn't make it a contingency because the buyers were just a few days away from closing escrow on their property. It looked like a good solid deal, and she didn't want to muddy up her purchase agreement by making it contingent, and there was a lot of competition for purchase agreements. Seller took that offer based upon what she had on the purchase agreement, that there were no contingencies. And sure enough, just before that escrow was supposed to close on the sale of the buyer's home, those buyers backed out, and it was quite a surprise to the sellers of the home they were purchasing. Long story short, it made our agent look very incompetent, and I think that if I remember correctly, those buyers ended up losing their earnest money because they were beyond their own contingency period. So got to put everything out on the table so everybody has full information to make disclosures or to make decisions as they go along. Number 5 is addenda and advisories. Anything that's checked in number 5 becomes attached to the purchase agreement. And you may have some other things. Now we have a coronavirus addendum, one for buyers, one for sellers. We've got the PEAD. Everybody has to use these coronavirus forms. We're going to talk about this in the office meeting once again tomorrow. So if you can be here, John's really looking for as many people to be here at the office meeting tomorrow as possible. And I think it's critical that we get on top of this coronavirus addendum thing, because right now it changes frequently and we have to stay on top of it, which is a part of the agent's job also. Okay. Other terms. If there are other terms, and there may be other terms, as an example, maybe the purchase of this property is going to be conditioned upon the buyer's parents coming from out of town to give their blessing to this purchase for their child. We see that from time to time. There can be other conditions too. Maybe it is a final acceptance on a job transfer or something like that. But whatever the buyer needs to have as a condition of purchase or terms, maybe there's a term that maybe the buyer understands that the seller has a condition of getting a job transfer, they're not going to sell, and so they want to restate that in the purchase agreement. There's any number of things that could go there in that space. Okay, allocation of costs. I think we did talk about this a little bit the other day. As you can see in number 7, there are 2 boxes all the way down on page 2 and continued on page 3, where you can check either buyer or seller, who's going to pay for something. The reason that there is a choice is that there really isn't any law that says what somebody has to do to pay for or not pay for, even to have most of these things. We'll talk about them as we go down. But as a part of strategy, you strategize an offer according to what the market is, to what the needs of your buyer or seller are. Strategy is a very important thing, and it's very important for you as an agent to learn how to strategize your offers. So as an example, as we go down the items in 7A and B and 8 on the next page, so on and so forth, I'm going to tell you what's typical in this area. California is a very large state. There are a lot of areas where things are done differently than the way that we do them here in the San Joaquin Valley, in the Central Valley. Big cities tend to do things differently. The North does things differently than the South. The coast does things differently than the desert. All of these are taken into consideration, and you have to know about them when you're strategizing your offer. Okay, so the first one is inspections, reports, and certificates. The first one is a natural hazard disclosure report. That's a third-party report prepared by a third-party company, and it's purchased through escrow. There's a number of companies that provide these. They range in price from about $29 to about $79, and the reports run from a few pages up to about maybe 70 some pages if you're getting a good report. You want a good report. This is not the place to try to show your seller how brilliant you are by choosing a cheap report thinking you're saving him money. This is not the place to do it. You want to get the best report you can. Our company recommends basically 2 companies. The first company is Property ID, and you'll see in 7A 1 where it says either the buyer or seller shall pay for a natural hazard zone disclosure report, including tax, environment, or other, and prepared by. The best company to get this through that the company suggests is Property ID. Property ID has a $20 million E&O policy which protects all parties, including the agents and brokers, if they make a mistake. Okay? They're about the only company that has that. Fidelity is the next company. Their product is called Disclosure Source. We've used them very much in the past. We put Property ID number 1 mainly because of that E&O insurance. Some of those companies that provide natural hazard disclosure reports don't really give information germane to a specific property. They tend to be very um, generic in recommending that the buyer know that they have to do research in a certain area on a certain situation, but they don't give them specific information except for perhaps an email a website address where they can get on and do their own research. A good company is going to go APN by APN and give specific information to that particular APN address. It's very, very important to get that. You don't want to advise a client that they need to look on a website at a flood map to determine for themselves if that property is in a particular flood zone or a wildfire area or something like that. You want that NHD to specifically say this property is or is not in a 500-year floodplain or a flood inundation area, that kind of thing. Don't want us, buyer, to be surprised someday whenever we get one of those 500-year floods that come along every once in a while, or a 100-year flood, and they didn't get a report that warned them that that property was in the pathway of that kind of flooding. So that's why these things are important. It should be very specific to the property you're selling, the APN. Okay. And here, generally in this area, the seller pays for the NHD. As a listing agent, it's nice if they can get that ahead of time, attach it as an attachment in the MLS for the buyer to look at. But certainly we have to get this to a buyer within the 7-day period that the seller has to provide their due diligence. And in most cases, the NHD is considered to be something that the seller provides. Okay. All right. In number 2 and 3, it says seller shall pay for the following report. Generally here, we're going to put a pest inspection, and typically the pest inspection is paid for by the seller, but it doesn't have to be paid for by the seller. It can be paid for by the buyer. If you're going to check that the seller is going to pay for it, what the seller's paying for is the inspection report. He's not promising to do Section 1 or Section 2 corrective work. He's not promising to do anything except provide that report to the buyer. Once the report comes out and all parties can see what problems may exist or not exist on a property, then it can be determined who's going to pay for any corrective work that needs to be done. Okay. You want to make sure that you put a licensed and bonded pest control operator. Most of them are, but there may be somebody every once in a while, somebody kind of services that really isn't licensed. We can only deal with licensed vendors here. The only trade that we deal with that is not licensed is the home inspector. Usually they are certified through some education that they've had. There are a number of good companies out there that certify home inspectors, give them some education, so on and so forth. But for some reason, the state of California does not license, at least up to this point, a home inspector. Okay. There's room for 2 reports there. You certainly could add more if you were going to have the seller pay for more reports or the buyer. But some options there would be a roof inspection. You can ask for a certification with the roof report. Usually those Roof inspections are good for about 90 days. In truth, any inspection that's done is really good for that day because anything can change after the inspection. So um, sometimes lender will honor certain reports for up to 90 days, sometimes not. So a roof inspection, if you have a property that has a septic tank or a well, then you always want to have a septic inspection and a current well report. A septic inspection, the only way a septic tank can be inspected is to dig down to where the lid is, remove the lid, then that septic inspector can inspect it. The only way they can certify it is to pump it. You may hear somebody say, these people have lived in this house for the last 35 years. They've never had it pumped, and they recommend that you don't pump it. I would say that that's a big fallacy because everybody lives in a house differently. And if the people that have lived there 35 years has been a couple and they do 2 loads of laundry a week, maybe they've got a total of 4 showers and minimal usage of the water, and a family moves in that's got 4 kids and they use the dishwasher and the washing machine 3 times a day and all of the showers and all of the water usage, they're going to use that house much differently, and it's going to affect that septic tank much differently than the people that didn't pump it for 35 years. I would say pump it. Start out with a fresh septic tank with the new buyers coming in. That way you know, and they can judge their own usage too. But it's very important to explain to people that no 2 families, no 2 individuals use things like septic and water and for that matter, power usage, whatever, the same way. Everything's going to be different for different users. Okay. B talks about government requirements and retrofit. And in B, it's the seller that pays for the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide installation and water heater bracing. California state law says that we're not supposed to pass title from a seller to a new buyer unless the water heater is properly strapped, unless there are operable smoke detectors in place at the time the title passes. It used to be, well, I'm not going to tell you what it used to be. I'm going to tell you what the current law is. Current law is smoke detectors have to meet the standards of the current state fire marshal's directives. And the directive is that there is a working smoke detector in each bedroom or sleeping area. There has to be one then in the hallway, and there has to be one on each floor. So if you've got a 3-story house, and we've got some 3-story houses in this area, you need a smoke detector on every floor as a minimum, and then one in each bedroom or sleeping area, okay? You also need a carbon monoxide detector. That's a federal law, but it kind of falls into place with the smoke detectors because, as an example, when the appraiser goes out, he's going to look for both and call both if they aren't there. So the water heater strapping has to be, and it has to be about 1/3 of the way down from the top and 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. If it's a gas appliance, it used to be that they had to be elevated, I think, because of the pilot light. If it's, Nitz, do you know if it's a water heater with an electronic ignition, do they have to be raised now?
I don't think those those need to be raised because it's raised because of the gas
Yeah.
that flows off of it.
Okay.
But it still has to be strapped.
Has to be strapped for sure. And that's the state law. You can't put in your purchase agreement that buyer will take care of that unless the buyer is going to do it before the close of escrow, because we have to verify that those things are done before title can pass. Okay, very important. Um, I've heard of some agents saying, I bought new smoke detectors, they're on the kitchen counter. That doesn't qualify. They have to be in place in the area, in the room where they're going to serve, in order for us to pass title on those. So very important that those things are taken care of properly. Okay, at the bottom of page 1 and 2 and all the way through, you're going to see at the bottom there's a place for the sellers to initial, a place for the buyers to initial, and you need as an agent to make sure that there's initials on those pages all the way through. It's very important that they are there. Okay, on page 3, up at the top, from page 2 all the way through the end, you want to make sure that the address and the date are on the top. It seems obvious that that should be there, but the reason is this. Sometimes we end up preparing for the same buyer, sometimes even on the same property. But even if it's not the same property, if you've made 2 or 3 different offers for a buyer and you don't have a date and a property address, you may have strategized one offer different than the other, and then pages get mixed up, and then you're looking at one copy, somebody else is looking at another copy, and you've got different things going on, and it can become an absolute nightmare on a very entangled legal thing if you get those pages mixed up. Best way to avoid that is to make sure the property address and the date. And which date do you use? It's the preparation date that's on page 1 up on the upper left-hand side. The date that you actually prepared it is the date that's going to come through on all of your pages. Okay. And seller shall pay the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports if required as a condition of closing under any law. Buyer and seller shall pay the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory retrofit standards. And then buyer shall be provided within the time specified in 14A a copy of any required government conducted or point of sale inspection report prepared pursuant to this agreement. I don't think in this area we have any. And what I see most of the time, buyers agents will go through and check these boxes, and usually it'll be followed up with a counteroffer from the seller removing item 7B2, 1 and 2 from the purchase agreement. So at this point in time, I'm not familiar with any myths. Are you?
Water heater strapping and smoke detectors, so that's a whole different document anyways.
Yeah.
And just for health and safety, that should be done anyway, even if it wasn't a government
Yeah.
entity.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't run into an issue where that clause
Yeah.
came into play.
No, I haven't either. There may be something in some areas. As an example, over in San Luis Obispo County, South San Luis Obispo County, had a thing where you couldn't pass title unless the building department from those entities, those little cities, actually went out and verified that there were low flow toilets and faucets and shower heads. So that involves somebody from the city going out for every sale. And that's been going on since the 90s. we have a new mandate from the state as of January 2017 that said we have to have that anyway. So that kind of took care of that. Anyway, I don't know of anything in this area to be concerned about at this point in time. So escrow and title. In this area, it's common for the buyer and the seller to share the escrow fee, usually 50-50. So you can put an X in the buyer and the seller and shall pay the escrow fee and usually it's a 50-50 split. If you were trying to strategize, and let's say the buyer's trying to make the offer look as clean as possible, they're going to absorb some of those costs. The buyer could pay the whole thing and not check the seller box. Or if that buyer really is penniless and has no money to go in, they probably can't really afford to buy a house, but maybe under some circumstances, they want the seller to pay everything. Maybe the seller has said, this is an investment property. I want to pay everything because I can use that against my basis for an investment property. So there's a lot of ways to strategize things. And it's just knowing when to put those into play and how they can benefit somebody. But typically for your average ordinary residential purchase in this area, it's split 50-50, the escrow fee. And the escrow holder shall be, and here again in this area, it's usually the listing agent, the agent of the seller, and supposedly the seller has the right to choose who they want the escrow holder to be. So most sellers don't have a clue and probably could care less in most cases, so it's that listing agent. If your buyer has a real reason that they want to specify who they would like the escrow to be with, maybe they want to do a concurrent closing and it would just facilitate the whole thing if they could do it. Yes, exactly. Yeah, a 1031 exchange, exactly. If you can do that at the same title company, it's going to make things a lot easier. Communication is easier and things just get done in a more direct and smooth manner. So you can request, and I certainly would let the other agent know why. Sometimes there's a real power play between agents, and a little communication can go a long ways in getting things the way that they should be that are really going to facilitate the buyer and the seller. So communication is very important for something like that. Okay. If you're going to put something like seller may choose or seller shall determine, if you want it to be the seller's choice and the buyer is just handing that choice over to the seller, you can put it there, seller may choose, seller to determine. What you don't want to put is seller's choice, because years ago everybody was putting seller's choice, and then somebody someplace got the wise idea to start a company called Seller's Choice Escrow. And once there's something on that page like Seller's Choice, if that company exists, then escrow has to go through that company. And we don't have any around here, but there are some in some areas. So we have to be very careful not to ever say seller's choice. But seller shall determine, may determine, seller may choose, however you want to say it. Okay. And then it says the party shall within 5 days after receipt sign and return the escrow holder's general provisions. Once escrow is opened, and it's usually opened by the listing agent, once escrow is opened, The escrow officer is going to get a copy of the ratified contract, meaning the purchase agreement, and if there are any counteroffers, if there is any kind of an addendum attached to it, the escrow officer gets all of that. Those are the escrow officer's instructions, and then the escrow company is going to send out some supplemental instructions of their own. And they will include their way of doing things, some of their requirements. They may have some routing numbers in there, perhaps, if somebody's going to do a wire transfer. Anyway, they're going to send those out. Buyer and seller both get a copy, and both of them have to sign those instructions and send them back. It used to be that an escrow officer couldn't do their job until they had those signed instructions back. I know now sometimes escrow officers are chasing those forms, and if they waited until they got them back, would probably never have a closing. So as an agent, prompt your buyers and sellers to return those at the earliest opportunity as soon as they can get them, because a lot of times they may not order the prelim or the NHD until they've got those signed instructions back. So it's very important. It's a part of what we as agents have to keep up with too. Okay. And in C2, the seller shall pay for the owner's title insurance policy, and it's to be issued. And again, if there is a reason that a buyer wants to choose, you certainly could put that here. Maybe they've got a credit. Maybe they had an escrow that fell out with another company and they've got a credit and they would like to be able to use that credit. They can request. The same with the seller. They may have a credit too. Typically, what we put there, again, is seller may determine. And in this area, because I don't know if we have any independent escrow companies here anymore. We did for a while. We had a couple. I think they may be gone. Jerry, do you know if Fresno escrow is still open?
What?
Fresno escrow used to be on the corner of Herndon and West. Yeah, they used to, but I think they're gone, aren't they?
You know, I haven't heard of it in years now.
Yeah.
I had to use them years ago when I sold it all.
Yeah.
And I didn't think much of it.
Yeah, no, they were a very poor company. I got involved with them too, and very poor company. Most escrow companies now are affiliated or part of a title company. Like we have First American Escrow and First American Title, all in the same building, all working there. The same with Fidelity, Old Republic, Chicago, North American, Placer. We've got a number of title companies. How do you choose? How do you know which escrow company to choose? Perhaps you're a listing agent and it's your first listing. Well, I would, as a new agent, go around and get to know some of the title companies. I realize it's a little bit hard now because so many companies aren't open, or they're open part-time, or you can only come with an appointment, or whatever the situation is. But if you can get to know some of the escrow companies and use several of them over a period of time, it's a way of not having all of your eggs in one basket. You get to know a number of people in the field, and you can direct certain kinds of transactions maybe toward one company and other transactions toward another company. Some specialize in business opportunities or commercial properties. Others will specialize maybe in exchanges and multi-unit sales, residential sales, that kind of thing. And you'll kind of learn as you go. You'll find your own preferred escrow officers. Okay. So the escrow fee is split between the buyer and the seller pays for the owner's title insurance policy. And they can choose who that's going to be issued by. And then if there's a loan on the property, there's always going to be a lender's title insurance policy, and the buyer always pays for that. It's less expensive than the owner's policy, but it has to be there. And then other costs in D1, the seller shall pay for the county transfer tax or fee. Can anybody remember how much that is? $1.10 per thousand. So if you've got an escrow and a selling price, you just take 1 point or $1.10 times whatever the thousands are. Okay, so if you've got a $250,000 sale, divide that by 1,000 times $1.10, and that will tell you how much the county transfer fee is. The next one down is a city transfer fee, and we don't have anywhere in the valley that I'm aware of do we have a city transfer fee. In other areas, they have those, and they can be extremely expensive. Up in the Bay Area, some of those are $15 per thousand. So the cost of selling a house up in the Bay Area can be exorbitant because they have that city fee and the county fee, and who knows what else they might have up there. But sometimes in escrow instructions, you'll see a fee schedule for all the different cities. And
Why do they differ in price? I don't get it.
I think that it's just been mandated by the local municipality, this local city government.
I always wondered about that because
Yeah,
why would San Jose be 3 times the cost of us and Sacramento being twice as much as us? But I don't know. It just seems kind of funny.
yeah. And I've wondered why we haven't caught on, why they aren't doing it here. It's great that they aren't. I mean, everybody's taxed to death as it is, but I think it's actually San Francisco that's $23, isn't it? $23 per thousand. And there's probably nothing under $1 million for sale in San Francisco anymore. Okay, so don't put anything in D2 because it's going to be countered out. And 3 is the homeowners association, the HOA transfer fees, buyer, seller. Typically it's the seller, but a lot of times I see that the buyer, and if it's an REO, the buyer has to pay for it, don't they? Yeah. Okay. And then in number 4, the seller shall pay the HOA fees for preparing documents required to be delivered. And then number 5, buyer or seller shall pay HOA fees for preparing all documents other than those required by the civil code. And then number 6, buyer to pay for any HOA certification fee. So there's a lot of charges involved with those HOA transfer fees and all of that stuff. If you are selling a house that is part of an HOA, you want to make sure to start getting those HOA documents right away. And even if you're the buyer's agent and that's something the seller's supposed to do, as soon as escrow's open, I would get a hold of that escrow officer and say, you know, I know you noticed that there were HOA things in there. When do you think we can have those? Or what's your procedure with doing those? Because if they don't get right on those, the HOA companies, and there's what, 4 or 5 around this area that take care of most of the HOAs in the area, they can be extremely independent about getting their work done. And sometimes not real nice about how they do things. And they can also be very expensive. Total fees in an HOA could be several $100s. Um,
350.
yeah. Okay. And then when you get the HOA documents, it's really best to get an email address for your buyer and have all of these kind of things, if possible, emailed. You don't want to print them out because sometimes they're a minimum of a ream of paper on both sides. So send those. You do not want to be the person reading those for the buyer, trying to determine if there's anything in there that that buyer's going to take exception to or not like. That's their job, because what may be perfectly acceptable to you could be very unacceptable to that buyer and vice versa. So they need to read that for themselves. They've got to take it upon themselves to be familiar with those documents. And it requires some homework. It requires some time to look at those and go through them and make sure. Sometimes they're going to have some age restrictions. They may have pet restrictions. They may have guest restrictions. They may have yards, landscaping restrictions. They may have exterior color restrictions. Some of them have restrictions if you have a garage door about when you can have it open and when it has to be closed. So there's a lot of things in there that buyers have to see if they're going to be comfortable with. Okay. Number 7 is a private transfer fee. An easy way to remember this is the Tahiti fund for the people that have the transfer fee. Let me tell you what these are and how they got started. Lennar is a builder in California, all over the state. And over the years, they've built tens of thousands of houses. Years ago, people stayed in a house about 2 to 5 years. Now people are staying in houses 7 to 10 years. We don't know how that's going to play out in the future, whether people will be selling and moving more, staying put forever, we don't know. But when Lennar was building these tens of thousands of homes all over the state, somebody in Lennar had the brilliant idea that if every time one of the Lennar houses sold, they could collect a percentage of the sales price and put it in a charitable trust, that they would have a lot of money for this charitable trust. So it's supposed to be about 0.5%. What I usually see is something between about $200 and $275 for those transfer fees. They're on every Lennar property. You can just count on it. And Wathen Castanos has them on Harlan Ranch. There may be some other instances. There were some individuals a few years ago that went around trying to buy the rights to transfer fees by initiating their own. I don't think that went over too well. I haven't seen any of those, and I haven't seen people going around trying to do that. But you will see those on Lennar properties, and your buyer has to know that the seller is going to pay at this time, but when they sell the house, they're going to have to pay that transfer fee on the sales price, and it's about 0.5% of the sales price. So actually, I think it's way under 0.5%.
I think I had one, that one gated community house, I think it was like 350.
Was it?
353.19 that went to that, whatever
that Lennar Charitable Trust?
charitable organization.
Yeah, that's what they call it. And I don't know where they're doing all of that charity, but I've never seen Lennar give a penny to anybody in any of my closing statements to get somebody into a house. So that's why I call it the Tahiti Fund, because I think they put all of that money every time a Lennar house sells into a fund, and then somebody goes to Tahiti for a vacation. Okay. And then you've got spaces in 8, 9, and 10, or 8 and 9, for the buyer or seller to pay for something else if there's something else they're going to pay for. There's all kinds of inspections that you can have: geologic, roof, pest, pool, chimney. There's just all kinds of inspections. So if you feel that there's a reason to have an inspection on something, you can put it in there. And if it's important enough to a buyer, they probably will be willing to pay for it. They certainly can ask the seller to pay for it, and it becomes an item of negotiation then. Number 10 is the buyer or seller shall pay the cost not to exceed so many dollars of a standard or upgraded 1-year home warranty plan issued by and then the company. In this area, it's typical, it used to be typical that that cost would be split between the buyer and the seller. I guess if I'm thinking, I see it about a third. A third of them, the buyer paying for them, a third of them, they're asking the seller to pay for them, and a third of them, they're still splitting. So it's negotiable anyway. However you put it in there, it can be negotiated. For our company, we have a policy that we have to explain a home warranty to a buyer and the benefits of it. And if that buyer decides they're not interested in it, we have to have a waiver in our file stating that if they had the opportunity to get a home warranty and decided that it wasn't that important to them. A typical home warranty in the neighborhood of $450, depends on the size of the house.
$450 for fidelity. I've noticed the American Home Shield is a little bit more expensive. So I think a full policy full is over $550.
Yeah.
Almost 600.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see quite a few of them. If you add in appliances and this and that on a lot of their options, you can get up $700 or $800. So, So if it's paid for the first year, then that homeowner has the option of continuing with that home warranty if they want to on their own. A lot of the agents here in the company have home warranties on their own properties because they are beneficial. And it's a good way for a seller to escape being sued for something after the close of escrow, because it's what I mentioned before. People live in houses differently. And so often when a new family moves in and they're using that house differently than the last people, that's when something goes wrong. It used to be, because we had appliances with pilot lights, if you turned off the utilities and had to relight a pilot light, I almost always knew I was going to have to pay for something once the utilities went off. Now we've got electronic pilot lights, thank goodness, and people don't have to pay for as much. But you never know when something's going to happen that first year, and everything can be absolutely wonderful at the close of escrow and working beautifully. But 6 or 9 months later, something happens. And who's the first person a buyer's going to call? A new homeowner 9 months later when a problem happens. They're going to call the agent. So if they have that home warranty, you can remind them, you've got a home warranty, call them, have them come out and take a look. There's a good chance that something can be taken care of by a home warranty. There's a variety of companies, many companies, and we use all of them a little bit. We used to use Fidelity a lot, and Sue would come and give a report every quarter about how much money Fidelity had paid out for our clients. And it was in the thousands upon thousands of dollars that they paid out because things go wrong, and it's a good way to provide a service to a buyer. Okay. If the buyer says that they just are not interested, they don't want to pay for it, they don't think it's necessary, you can waive getting a home warranty right here on the purchase agreement. So if you put an X in that box where it says buyer waives the purchase of a home warranty plan, nothing in this paragraph precludes buyers purchasing a home warranty plan during the term of this agreement. So at any time they could decide, well, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea. A few $100 spread over 12 months of protection is a pretty good deal, really. And let's say escrow closes and they still come back later and say, I would like to have a home warranty. That can be ordered. They can order that at any time. It's just nice to have it in place when escrow closes, because that so often is when something happens, because people do use properties differently. Okay. And then items included in and excluded from the sale. A note to buyer and seller. Items listed as included or excluded in the MLS, flyers, or marketing materials are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless specified in paragraph 8, B, or C. So no matter what the flyer says, no matter what it says in the MLS, no matter what discussions anybody has had, no matter if the buyer and seller just happened to meet at the property and shook hands on something, it's not a part of the contract unless it's in writing and unless it's on your purchase agreement. Okay, so anything that they agree upon, especially in the way of what's going to be left, what the seller's going to take with them or not going to take with them, has to be in writing. So I'm going to give you some examples that we had right here in this company to show you how important it is to think this through and to make sure that everything is in writing and that you have a discussion with every seller about everything. Never assume that something is going to be there. First example, we had an agent who had buyers for a property. The house was vacant at the time that she showed it, and there was a refrigerator and a washer and dryer in the house. And those things showed right in the photos in the MLS. So her assumption was that they were a part of the purchase. A week before the close of escrow, this agent got a call, and the seller's agent said, if your buyer is interested in the washer, dryer, and refrigerator, my seller will sell them to them for $1,500. Our agent said, well, we just assumed they were included because they were there. They hadn't been moved. The house was vacant. Nothing was said that they were being taken. They showed in all of the pictures. And the listing agent said, I'm sorry, my seller will sell them to you for $1,500. So she went back to her buyers and said, how important are those appliances to you? And they said, they're very important to us. That's why we chose that house to make an offer on, because we didn't have the money it would take to go out and buy new appliances, and we were just thrilled that they were there. To make a long story short, she ended up having to take $1,500 out of her commission and pay for those appliances because she didn't negotiate for them on the purchase contract. We had another situation that one of our agents sold a house to one of his clients that had a refrigerator, and it was a very expensive refrigerator, not unlike the one that's built in over there. It was a built-in type of refrigerator. And this buyer bought the house for his mother, and she lived in LA. She came up and she looked at the house and looked at Fresno and decided she didn't want to live here and she was not going to move in that house. So the seller waited or this guy waited about 5 months for his mom to make a decision, and she said, I'm not moving there. So he put it back on the market. At the time that the agent that sold it to him put the house back on the market, that refrigerator was there. And of course, the house was vacant. A buyer came along, bought the house, saw the refrigerator, and escrow closed. And the day escrow closed and the buyer was going in, that refrigerator was gone. And so our agent called the seller and said, you took out the refrigerator. It was there when you bought it. What have you done? And he said, well, refrigerator is considered personal property. And I took it, and you didn't tell me I couldn't, and I'm not bringing it back. And at that point in time, our agent had to pay $7,500 for a refrigerator. So no matter how many times you have to ask the question every time. What is staying? What is not staying? The things that you think are staying. I was at a house yesterday. This guy owns a landscaping company, and he's got sago palms all over the yard. There's something magical in this area about sago palms. And he said, I'm taking the ones on, by the way, Mitch, on the side of the house. And one of them is quite tall, and it reaches up under the eaves. And he says that needs to be replaced anyway. So I think he's taking, there's about 4 of them there, or 3 or something. He's taking all of those, but there's some others out in the yard, and they look real nice. Ideally, he will have those gone before he gets a buyer. But those are the kind of things, if sellers are going to, it's like we talked about in our listing class, talk to the seller. If they're going to remove something, they should remove those things before the close of it, or before the listing goes on the market, so that a buyer never sees them. If a buyer never sees them, they don't know what they're missing.
I had a sale where I had a listing, and it was a beautiful yard, but they were going to take the sago palms. They had 4. One was for each daughter, and one was for the dog. And they planted them when they bought the house like 40 years ago, so they're huge. And he said, yeah, we're going to take these, we're going to give them to our children. And we actually had Juan Carlos Photoshop them out of the photography. And we made sure we put signs on them to say these don't go with the property.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes you have to go to those extremes to make sure people understand.
Yes. Yeah, I'll give you another example. We had another sale here. It was a short sale, and it was a single mother with 5 children in an extremely nice neighborhood. And she had sago palms, and she had this and that and all kinds of stuff all over. And the buyer had granted her the ability to stay in that house until school was out. And but the buyer had been in that house several times when he made the offer, and then he was there for a home inspection, and he was there a couple of other times over this long course of period waiting for school to be out. So he knew exactly what was in that house, and every time he went, something was missing. And long story short, at the close of escrow, when he got there, she had dug up all of these palm trees and had a trailer load of stuff that she was taking away that were supposed to have been there. She had nice ceiling fans. Oh, sorry. Ceiling fans that she had replaced with very inexpensive ceiling fans. And when he came the day that escrow closed that afternoon, and she had a truck full of stuff that she was taking away, he said, you put all of that stuff back right now, or I'm calling the police. And then the agent called the company. I live out close to that area. It was the end of the day. I was headed that way. They asked if I would go out to that house and talk to this lady. And I did. And she had 2 little toddlers with her. And there were 2 police cars there. And they were going to arrest her for grand larceny. And I said, is it really worth it? Is a sago palm worth your children seeing you handcuffed and they go into protective care over a stupid palm tree? And it took a lot of talking to get her to leave those things at the house that day and to go away. John Jr. actually bought her a bunch of sago palms for her new house to make her happy. But those are the kind of things that we get into, and it can be very unpleasant sometimes. Okay. It says, included in the sale, all existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. So what is a fixture and a fitting? A fixture is maybe a shelving unit. A fitting might be a bracket that holds the TV on the wall or something like that. So any of those kinds of things, anything that's attached are supposed to remain with the property. Existing electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, and heating fixtures, ceiling fans, fireplace inserts, gas logs and grates, solar power systems, built-in appliances, window and door screens, awning shutters, window coverings, attached floor coverings, television antennas, satellite dishes, air coolers, conditioners, pool and spa equipment, garage door openers, remote control systems, the mailbox, in-ground landscaping, tree, shrub, water features and fountains, water softeners, water purifiers, security systems, alarms, and the following if checked. All stoves except, and all refrigerators except, and all washers and dryers except. If there's a refrigerator in the garage and there's one in the kitchen and the seller says, I'm leaving the refrigerator, you have to be very specific about which refrigerator is going to be where when your buyer takes possession, because they may take that beautiful French door refrigerator and replace it with a single door freezer on the top from the garage that's not energy efficient and put it there. It wasn't negotiated any differently. It was just assumed. You can never assume anything. You have to be very specific. Refrigerator that is now in the kitchen, French door, freezer on the bottom, whatever it is that that buyer wants there, you have to put in writing what it's going to be.
Why did they say all stoves, all washers and dryers and stuff like that? Like that, I think that's more problematic than anything. Like, that's that whole refrigerator in the kitchen and there's
Yes.
one in the garage, right? I want all of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I would probably even use the word existing. I just think you have to be very specific. And as a listing agent, a buyer's agent, I'd probably find a way to snap a photo and tuck it in your file or something.
I mean, it's almost like they should have like refrigerator and a blank, like the kitchen or garage or whatever.
Yes.
To
Yeah. Yeah. And all washers and dryers. I don't know many households that have multiple sets of. I guess it's possible if it's a really big house and you've got 2 floors or so. Okay. And the following additional items, if there's anything additional. The one thing that we don't want to become, and John's very adamant about this, he says he is not in the used appliance business or the used furniture business. And to get into, sometimes you'll see a buyer that says, gosh, that furniture in the living room looks like it was custom made just for that area, and maybe it was. And so they want to ask the seller to leave that there as a part of the purchase price. Well, we don't like to get into making a warranty on that kind of stuff. Lenders don't like to loan on furniture because you've got a 30-year loan on a piece of furniture that may last 10 years, and they want to make exception to some of those things. So if there's going to be a situation where there's going to be furniture involved, I think the best way to do that is to have a separate side agreement with a bill of sale and not a part of the purchase agreement. The lender's going to like it better, John Kerry's going to like it better, and you're going to sleep better at night, not having to fight over the furniture. And I've seen that happen. It happens a lot with cabins. I remember a cabin that Nikki and Mandy had, and it was full of furniture. And they made long lists right down to artwork and knickknacks on a table and that kind of stuff. Oh my gosh, they went back and forth and back and forth. If one took one thing away, somebody else wanted to add two things. That's a nightmare. That's not our job or our business. Those people should have had a side agreement and we should have been out of the picture. But sometimes for things like that, we get involved. So, okay. If you're going to add something in, you can add it in. And then the existing integrated phone and home automation systems, including necessary components such as intranet and internet connected hardware or devices, control units, other than non-dedicated mobile devices, electronics and computers, and applicable software, permissions, passwords, codes, and access information are or are not included in the sale. I would imagine that that's something that's kind of growing with the way electronics are.
A lot of houses come with smart features now, like the new constructions.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll see more of that probably in the future too, huh?
Smart doorbells and
Yeah.
Thermostats, things like that.
Okay. And then this one is extremely important. Leased or liened items and systems. Seller shall, within the time specified in 14A, disclose to buyer if any item or system specified or otherwise included in the sale is leased or not owned by the seller, or specifically subject to a lien or other encumbrance, and delivered to buyer all written materials such as lease, warranty, etc., concerning any such item. Buyer's ability to assume any such lease or willingness to accept the property subject to any such lien or encumbrance is a contingency in favor of the buyer and seller as specified in paragraph 14B and C. We see these on a variety of things, but probably the biggest one is solar equipment or solar panels on a roof. If it's a purchase plan, if it's a lease plan, whatever it is, if it isn't owned outright by the seller, then that buyer has to be fully aware of how much that costs per month until it's paid for or until the lease is out, because those are going to factor in, for one thing, into the buyer's ability to qualify for a loan, because they're going to be structured in as a part of the payment. So very important to know about those. Very important for a buyer to see those lease agreements as early as possible, because they need to make a determination. People used to bring those lease agreements to me and ask me to look at them and tell them what I thought. I cannot look at a lease agreement for solar and say anything about it, because first of all, I don't understand everything about them. Second, I'm not an attorney. If they need advice like that, they have to see an attorney and let an attorney go through it. And you as an agent certainly don't want to ever read anything like that for a buyer and determine whether it's okay, not okay, how it's going to affect them. And some of those solar leases are not real good.
Yeah, I think it's best to have the buyers consult the company and let unfortunately, they're going to deal with their salespeople. But I think that's the people that know their least best.
Yes.
So you just tell them to
Contact the solar company as soon as possible, have them explain the way that the procedure works. In the contracts, if they're the easier contracts to read, there's a place that says upon sale, and it'll kind of describe the different avenues you have as a buyer or want to sell it, but not all of them have that on it.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
So just tell them to talk to the company regularly.
a lot of those leases are long. They're very long.
Yes. Mitch, a lot of those companies have gone out of business too. What happens if they've gone out of business? They're still collecting the money somewhere.
According to what I've read online, some of the companies that went belly up, although the servicer, the person that did the installation, is the person that supposedly was collecting, once they go under, it goes back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is supposed to honor the warranty for the merchandise, but not the workmanship of the installation.
Oh.
So,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, I know. You better go with a really big reputable company. So,
Who's the best? Do you have any idea?
I have no clue,
I don't either. Okay. Other lease and lien things would be satellite dishes and water systems,
propane tanks.
propane tanks, yes.
People that live up in the mountains, they have a tank so it holds all the gas for their stoves and the heating.
Okay. Seller represents that all items included in the purchase price, unless otherwise specified, are owned by seller and shall be transferred free and clear of liens and encumbrances, except the items and systems identified pursuant to 8B5, and are transferred without seller warranty regardless of value. And then items excluded from the sale, unless otherwise specified, the following items are excluded from the sale: audio and video components such as flat screen TVs, speakers, and other items. If any such item is not itself attached to the property, even if a bracket or other mechanism attached to the component or item is attached to the property, furniture and other items secured to the property for earthquake purposes. Okay. So if you have, as an example, I've got a tall china hutch and we have a bracket on the top that holds it so that if there's an earthquake, it doesn't tip forward. So that would be excluded, but we'd have to take that bracket off and repair it if we ever move. And a lot of people do that. Now people do that on baby furniture so that babies don't tip over those chest of drawers and dressers and things, because a lot of babies are killed every year from that. So they put those brackets to hold them, which is a good thing. Okay. It says brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, or item shall remain with the property, or if you check it, will be removed and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So I would almost think it would be best if there's a TV bracket to remove it and patch it over, because how are you ever going to find anything to fit on that bracket?
You know, it kind of depends. Like,
does it?
The very uncomplicated TV mounts they're all about the same length and they connect the same way.
Yeah.
But that's only one style. There's a lot of ones that are articulating, and that's very difficult to find something that'll fit on those things. So it is a fixture. It's attached to the wall. But if I had my brothers, I'd rather have somebody, take it off.
Take it out.
I've had that done many times.
Yeah,
It's not that expensive to have a bigger building floated out for you.
yeah.
So,
Okay. Closing and possession. Buyer intends or does not intend to occupy the property as buyer's primary residence. This is an extremely important question here. It's extremely important for you as an agent, because if the wrong answer is here, and you know that it's the wrong answer, it could make you an accomplice to fraud. So let's discuss what this is all about. It says the buyer intends or does not intend to occupy the property as buyer's primary residence. This is most important if there's a loan. If there isn't a loan, it really doesn't matter. It's between the buyer and the IRS what they choose. But if there's going to be a loan on the property and the buyer says that they intend to live in this as their primary residence, they're going to get a better loan and a better interest rate. It's going to be easier to qualify for with a better interest rate than what an investor buyer would be getting. So if you're working with people and you ask them if they're going to live in the property and they say yes, and then you hear them chatting about things about a tenant in the future or this or that, I would have a discussion with them about what their true intent is, because if they defraud a lender and you don't take exception to it, you are as guilty as they are, or could be found to be guilty, because a lender does not like for people to say to them, I'm going to live here, when they don't. Because it used to be when a buyer was getting a loan on a property that lenders would look at about 10% of the new loans to see if they actually were owner occupied. So that left a 90% chance they'd never knock on your door. Now, with what we went through about 10 years ago with all the lender fraud that we had, I've been told that lenders verify 100% of the loans that are owner occupied. They're going to check with every single buyer.
What about if you buy it? You say, okay, this I'm gonna live here, but you live there for like 3 months and then you move out. That's not part.
Yeah, no, if unless you have a reason like a job transfer or something, but you probably should get a hold of your lender and say, we didn't know we were going to be getting a job transfer. We're moving from Fresno to Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever, and we don't know how long that's going to last, if it's going to be forever. We want to rent our house here and not put it on the market at this point in time because we may be coming back. So if you have something like that and you talk to your lender, they probably will work with you. But 100% of the time, they're going to check to see who answers the front door. And if it's not the owner, or if the mailing address for the owner changes from that address, then they're probably going to call the loan due. And if they feel like they actually have been defrauded, they may go after that buyer for fraud. But at the very least, they're going to call the loan due, which means that that buyer has to get new financing and pay for all of that. Or it'll go to foreclosure and they'll lose it in foreclosure again if they can't refinance it. So it's a very important thing, and it's very important for us. And here's something you have to be careful with, especially in an area like this. We live in an area that is served by a college, in fact, numerous colleges here. And a lot of times parents will come to Fresno and buy a house because it's cheaper for them to buy a house for their child to live in while they're going to school than to pay rent or to have them live on campus. Plus, if they get a 2 or 3 bedroom house, they can rent out those bedrooms, and that helps defray the expenses even more. So we see a lot of parents that buy homes for their children, and they will say, yes, this is owner occupied. It's going to be owned by or occupied by my daughter. And, but the lender's going to say that is not owner occupied. According to the IRS, you can only have one owner occupied property that a taxpayer claims. So usually it's going to be the one that's going to benefit them most to have as their primary residence. And most people aren't going to transfer that primary residence from where they live to where their child's going to school. So it's very important for them to understand they're going to get in trouble with the IRS, they're going to get in trouble with the lender, and they're going to call the loan due. There may be, and Mitch, you probably know the answer to this, there may be a better rate for a second home than an investment property. I don't know.
I suppose.
Possibly.
Yeah, but during the foreclosure times, the guys were like doubling up houses. They had that maximum amount of loans you could have, and they would have their relative buy a house as claim it as their primary residence, and then rent it out.
Yeah.
I mean, that was really frowned upon, but
Yeah.
people doing it, I couldn't believe it. And they flat out lied to us and the banks,
Yeah.
a lot of times. And we kind of knew it, like this person doesn't seem like he's interested in the right way.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Seller occupied or vacant property possession shall be delivered to buyer at 6 p.m. on the date of close of escrow, or no later than so many calendar days after close of escrow, or at a specified time and date. Our recommendation is that the day that escrow closes, seller is out of the property and buyer gets the keys. The reason it says 6 o'clock there on the day of closing is because escrow companies usually close between 5 and 5:30. And so on the day of closing, by 6 o'clock, all of the funds will have been dispensed, and the recording will have occurred, and we will be notified that that actually is a closed transaction. So that's giving escrow until 6 o'clock in case they need that much time. What you don't want to let happen is a seller to stay in the property after the close of escrow. And a lot of times in this area, they'll put seller to have 2 days past close of escrow before they have to give the property up. The theory behind that is that they want to verify that the closing actually did happen. They've got their money in hand. Now they can get their moving van to come and load everything up. That gives them time to do that. They didn't want to do that until the closing wasn't a sure thing. However, for 2 days then, we have a very delicate open can of worms, because anything can happen in that 2 days when that seller is there and no longer owns the property. What happens if it burns down? He's got to have his fire insurance in place. The buyer's fire insurance will be in place, but the seller has to have tenant insurance in place to cover his personal possessions that are on the property. He has to agree to cover the liability in case he does something, or the people he invites on the property does something, or he's got a pet that does something. There's a lot of liability involved in somebody occupying that property when they don't own it. So we like to see the seller gone on the day that it closes. We don't like to see a buyer take occupancy early, only because there are always things that can happen on the liability end. And that puts everybody in a very sometimes traumatic, delicate situation. So not to say that sometimes we don't accommodate early buyers and late sellers, because we do. Sometimes it just works out that way, but ideally we don't let that happen, because if there's going to be a problem happen, it's going to be when the buyer's there early or the seller's there late, and the liability is just too much. Okay.
If you guys got a second, I just learned something right now. Harvey and John needed an appraisal, and not an appraisal for a loan. They just needed it to help them figure out the cost and value of a particular property. I think John's was a difficult one because they weren't sure. I think because of the size. I think Harvey's one was one because he didn't know if it was conforming. The lenders, appraisers said that if it's not for a loan, we can do the appraisal for you, but for much less, because they don't have to have original photographs for the comp properties. They can just use the MLS comp. So if you guys ever need to use the appraiser for something like that, that's something to know. You know, that way you won't have to pay that full price in order to get a second opinion. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to treat it as a second opinion and use the same form, kind of like what I would do. But just use the MLS photographs and everything. So that's kind of cool.
Oh, that is. Could that work for a cash sale too?
Yeah, that's a point.
Okay.
Yeah, so no loans, so they don't have to have all those formalities.
Yeah.
There's a lot of addendums that they fill out that describe the property. They can use just the regular one that they use with the regular ready form.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, doing something new today.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thanks for sharing this. That's good information. Okay. Okay, at the top of page 4, it talks about seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. If the seller has the right to remain in possession after the close of escrow, the parties are advised to sign a separate occupancy agreement, such as the SIP form, the seller in possession, if they're going to be there less than 30 days. Sometimes a buyer likes to buy something because the timing is right. That seller needs to stay there for whatever reason for some extended period, up to 30 days. Here again, you have to consider the loan. If there's a loan on the property and that seller is going to stay there more than 30 days, that buyer, in the eyes of the lender, has just converted that to an investment property, and they may call the loan at that point in time. So timing is crucial if the seller's going to rent back a property with a loan on it for 30 days or less. 30 days or more creates a big problem. Sometimes to accommodate people, let's say the seller's coming from out of state, they have a property to sell back there, they don't have a real definite time frame. The seller's building a new house, and target dates for completion on new construction are real iffy. And so maybe that new house is extended a bit. So the seller on the property needs some extra time to get in the new home. The buyer can go ahead and tie up this property, but isn't ready to move in for whatever reason, and it works out. We get into those kinds of things from time to time too. Not very often. We don't like those because of the liability. But if buyer and seller are always the ones that are in control, as long as they aren't doing something illegally. Our job is to advise them, but not to make decisions. And if they decide that that's what they want to do, we will accommodate them with having the correct forms. to protect them and us as much as possible. Okay. There's another form, the RLAS, for seller continued occupancy, 30 days or more, and the parties are advised to consult with their insurance and legal advisors for information about liability and damage or injury to persons and personal and real property. And buyer is advised to consult with buyer's lender about the impact of seller's occupancy on buyer's loan. Tenant occupied property. This is really important. The property shall be vacant at least 5 days prior to the close of escrow. And the reason for getting the tenant out before the close of escrow, and by the way, tenants have a notice of 60 days now minimum for a notice to move. Used to be a 30-day notice, now it's 60 days, sometimes more. So they have to be very careful about that. And if there is a tenant and the buyer wants to close and the tenant isn't out, our very strongest advice is not to let that happen. Because if that tenant is in the property at the time that the escrow closes, then that new buyer has no contract with that tenant. And that tenant, all tenants know tenant law better than anybody. And they can find a way to stay in that property, even as a squatter, and it can take months of that buyer making the payment, paying the taxes, doing everything, wanting to be in that property, and they can't get that tenant out. So we very highly recommend that we do not close an escrow with a tenant in it if that tenant is supposed to be out. Don't close it early. Let that tenant get out before it closes, because the damage that can be done, the ill will, the tenant rights that they have supersede what that new buyer has.
When you buy a property that's got a tenant in it, even if you don't intend to rent it, you still ask for the tenant estoppel so that you know what's in deposits and things like that, or does that even matter?
Well, it shouldn't matter unless the new buyer is going to let that tenant stay there, because they should be out of the property. And if they're getting an owner-occupied loan and they start asking for information like that, that could put them in
I
jeopardy.
think it's 2 months, right? Didn't we ask you that question and we had to figure that one out?
Yeah.
You gotta move in within 2 months if it's owner-occupied, right? Like if they want to do a lease back or something like that.
Yeah, actually, you've got to notify the lender within 30 days if it's going to be more than 30 days and see what happens, because they may call the loan due. Yeah. Okay. Now, sometimes if a buyer is buying an investment property and that tenant is going to remain and that buyer is happy with that tenant, if they've got a good track record, the new buyer has been there, they keep the place nice and clean and tidy, and it shows pride of ownership, pride of occupancy, they may want to keep that tenant. And if it's a lease and they buy it that way, they have to honor the terms of the lease. They can't change that lease in any way, shape, or form. But if it's a month-to-month tenancy, they would form a new contract with that tenant that they're going to keep. And they do want an estoppel agreement, which is signed by the current landlord, the existing landlord or seller, and the tenant, and it shows any deposits on hand and shows the monthly rent. That's very important to get In this area, they do a lot of exchange of rent rolls, but a rent roll doesn't always tell you exactly what's going on, because sometimes a landlord will say to a tenant, I'll take $50 a month off of your rent if you will make sure the porch lights are out, or whatever they agreed to do. Maybe it's a small lawn, and if they'll mow the lawn or whatever it's going to be, they'll take $50 or $100 a month off the rent. And their rental agreement still shows that other figure. A new buyer comes along, and the buyer says, "Oh, my rent's $700," and that rental agreement shows $800. The estoppel agreement is going to be signed by both the existing seller and the tenant, and it should show exactly what the rent is, if there's any compensation for duties or anything like that, or any stipulation that the rent is reduced under certain conditions. All of that should be on that estoppel agreement. So
Deposits too, right?
yes, deposits too, so that the new buyer knows exactly. That way, somebody can't hold the new buyer hostage.
I forgot what I did. I bought the house with the tenant in it,
Mhm.
and then they asked me that they don't want to move. So I said, okay, that's fine. You can stay because I buy for investment anyway.
Yeah,
So yeah, I had the same tenant for like 11 years.
really? Oh, that's good. They must have been good people.
Yeah, then we go. Yeah, and I still use the same management company that he was on.
Ah,
Yeah, so like everything is still the same.
yeah.
I don't remember if it's the Sapo. If you think I need to do it.
I'm not sure that's really long.
Long
That's
time.
not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it would be good just for that point in time. Yeah, just so a buyer going into a new purchase knows exactly what's going on. So, yeah, that far after the fact would be, yeah, wouldn't be necessary.
And I think if I want to sell, I think I feel bad for them. They never want to move. Yeah, that's it.
They should buy it.
But I'm not selling it. So yeah, it's for my daughter.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. If the tenant is going to remain in possession, then there is a form, TIP, tenant in possession, that we would need to have a copy of. And then it says, at the close of escrow, the seller assigns to buyer any assignable warranty rights for items included in the sale, and shall deliver to buyer available copies of any such warranties. Broker cannot and will not determine the assignability of any warranties. And at the close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed in writing, seller shall provide keys, passwords, codes, and/or means to operate all locks, mailboxes, security systems, alarms, home automation systems, and intranet and internet connected devices included in the purchase price and garage door openers. If the property is a condominium or located in a common interest subdivision, buyer may be required to pay a deposit on the homeowner's, the HOA, to obtain keys to accessible HOA facilities. Okay. Any question about anything so far? Noe? Okay. All right. Next, we're going to talk about statutory and other disclosures, including lead-based paint hazard disclosures and cancellation rights. Statutory disclosures are the ones that are required by law, or there's a law about that disclosure that says we have to provide that disclosure. So that's what we're going to be talking about right now. We've got several of them. Seller shall, within the time specified in paragraph 14A, deliver to buyer, if required by law, a fully completed federal lead-based paint disclosure and the pamphlet lead disclosures, And unless exempt, fully completed disclosures or notices um, about some other things that we're going to talk about. But let's talk about lead-based paint. I don't know if we've talked about that yet. We have a little bit, huh?
Yeah, it's the house fires is 1978.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So any house built before 1978 or any structure that's occupied by people has to have a lead-based paint disclosure and that booklet. We are required to hand out the combined hazards booklet. We keep that. The best place to find out right now is in SkySlope. You can email it directly to your clients from SkySlope. It's a booklet that is probably about 40 pages, 30 some pages anyway. And it talks about lead-based paint. It talks about earthquake hazards and about strapping water heaters and so on and so forth. And we are required by the state of California to make sure every buyer, no matter the age of the property, gets that combined hazard book because it talks about earthquake safety. And one of the things that it mentions is turn off valves and where to turn off the water supply and the gas supply, so on and so forth. And surprisingly, a lot of homeowners don't know where those things are. So if they have a disaster, even if a pipe breaks inside the house, you have to know where that main water shutoff is, or you can flood your whole house. And that main water shutoff shuts off from the street to the house. So that book is very important, and we have to have an acknowledgement in our file that the buyer received that.
Just one outside the house.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right where it connects to the house, there's usually main connection there. Yeah. Don't feel bad. Most people don't know where they are.
I don't know.
A lot of wells outside.
Uh-huh.
What you're gonna do if I die?
Okay. So that book, you know, if there's any way to complicate something, the state of California usually knows how to complicate it. And I think they've complicated this process because what the law says is that it's the seller's duty to give this book to the buyer. Okay. I don't know of any seller that gives the book to the buyer, even when we had the books. Everybody signs a receipt. And I just wonder how often those books really get into the hands of buyers. There's very important information for every buyer in those books. And so for a long time, we've just made it kind of the assumed duty that the buyer's agent would make sure the buyer had a copy. Is that pretty much how it's handled out in the field, more or less, Miss? So
Emailed document.
an email document, yeah.
Probably never gets read.
So if you email from SkySlope that combined hazards book, there's one for commercial properties and there's one for residential properties, then we've done our duty. You can't make them read it, but we've put it in their hands, and by way of the internet, it's there and becomes easy to read. We don't want to print those books out because again, they're probably about 40 or 50 pages, a lot of very valuable information, but it is up to the buyer to read it then. Okay. The other things that we need to disclose, other than lead-based paint, have to do with the transfer disclosure statement, which is required here in California, the natural hazard disclosure statement. From that natural hazard disclosure statement, there used to be, and I think it's gone now, a 2-page NHD statement in zip forms, but I think they took it out. I haven't seen it much in the last year or so because most people were using that third party, and it's much better to use that third party source for the NHD. So that's what we're using. It's what most companies use, is the third party for the natural hazard disclosure. And it's going to talk about release of illegal controlled substances, notice of special tax and or assessments, or if allowed, substantially equivalent notice regarding Mello-Roos Community Facilities Act and improvement bond, and if seller has actual knowledge of industrial use, a military ordnance location. So if we get that NHD from escrow, it's going to cover all of those things that we're required to disclose. That's another reason we insist that it be in our SkySlope file, that the buyer and the seller both receive a copy of that. The seller's paying for it generally. They both get a copy and they can both look at it. The seller actually orders that for the benefit of the buyer, but they do get a copy of it so they can look at it too. And they should have had a copy when they bought it, the property. Okay. Any statutory disclosure required by this paragraph is considered fully completed if seller has answered all questions and completed and signed the seller's sections, and the seller agent, if any, has completed and signed the seller's brokerage firm sections, or if applicable, an agent visual inspection disclosure. Nothing stated herein relieves a buyer's brokerage firm, if any, from the obligation to conduct a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the property and disclose on section 4 of the TDS or an AVID form material facts affecting the value and desirability of the property that were or should have been revealed by such an inspection, or complete any sections on all disclosures required to be completed by buyer's brokerage firm. And then it says, note to buyer and seller, waiver of statutory and lead disclosures is prohibited by law. So let's talk about what you're going to see out in the field, what happens with other companies. Some companies just have never read this paragraph 12. Others don't understand it and don't attempt to. Others could care less and do what they want to do anyway. So here's what we see and here's what we have to do. I watch for the statutory disclosures very carefully. These are the ones that when we go over these, the TDS and the SPQ, I tell you that the seller has to hold the pen, the buyer can't hold the pen. I'm sorry, the seller has to hold the pen, the agent cannot hold the pen to fill these forms out. The seller has to be the one to complete them. And we see other companies that won't do a visual inspection. Or if they do one, they're going to do it on page 3 of the TDS and not the AVID. I have no idea what the reasoning is behind any of that. It's very obvious what the law is here, and they explain it the best that they can here. It's required, it has to be done. It can't be right between buyer and seller. That some of the agents around town could care less about these disclosures or doing them properly or legally. So every once in a while, I'll see a page like a TDS or an SPQ that has across it and it says seller exempt, bought the house at foreclosure. State of California doesn't care where they bought it, or how they bought it, or who they bought it from. State of California says if somebody owns a property that's not an REO company, but any individual that buys a property, or a company that buys a property and owns that property, they have knowledge about that property or they wouldn't have bought it. And so we have to have a TDS and an SPQ. It can't be waived because they bought it in foreclosure. Anybody that buys something in foreclosure and then spends 10 minutes or 6 months or a year getting ready to flip that property probably has more knowledge than anybody about that property. And to say that they have no knowledge, so they're not going to disclose anything, I don't think is right. I've talked to John Sweeney about this many times, and he says no matter what they do, no matter what they put on the addendum that they hand the buyer that says, buyer is buying this property under no circumstances the seller responsible for anything now or forevermore. John says if they have knowledge of something and don't disclose it, that's fraud. It would be up to a buyer to prove that they had knowledge and didn't disclose it. And I think that's where, to me, that's where the problem lies. The people that buy those houses to flip them usually have a great deal of knowledge, and I think they have a duty to disclose what they know and not wait for a buyer to try to prove that they did know something. So you're going to see things like that coming from other companies. We don't allow our agents to do those, and our agents wouldn't do something like that anyway. But you will see that, and it just is an ongoing problem. There's some agent out there right now that's doing a lot of those kind of, that kind of an addendum where he's saying,
Prior knowledge.
yeah, no prior knowledge.
They use everything they can to work the price down on the property, so of course they know everything about the price.
Yeah, they do. It's just a blatant.
So do you think that there's nothing you can do with it?
I guess.
Well,
They're supposed to.
yes. It shouldn't be on the buyer to prove a liar wrong. They should just be truthful from the beginning. Here's what I would do, and I know why people don't do this, but I wish I had a copy of that addendum. The addendum is almost a full addendum page, a paragraph, a long paragraph that says, seller bought this property in foreclosure, has no knowledge. Buyer is buying this property and has had every opportunity to investigate and will henceforth and forevermore hold the seller harmless from anything that the seller should have said, that they've had the ability to do all of their investigations and they are totally satisfied with this property and will never ever ask the seller for anything. And if I had a buyer, I wouldn't let a buyer sign a stupid addendum like that. They don't have to sign something just because it's put in front of them. But most agents know that there's a lot of competition out there and that the next agent will have their buyers sign that stupid addendum no matter what. And so they don't want their buyer to lose out, so they encourage their buyer to go ahead and sign it. And I fully understand that because the competition is stiff. But I think it would be fun to test somebody someday and say, we'll buy your property, but we're not signing that stupid thing. Have you ever seen anybody refuse this? No, I know. Yeah. 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 Which to me just makes them look like,
Yeah.
it just says crook all over the place. They might as well put it in neon when they do that. To me, that's what it looks like. I don't see protection there. I see a wall to hide behind, a sheet of paper to hide behind.
Well, the ones that look the worst are the guys that, A, they go to a specific title company, get their title policy from them, and then reuse it. Have their own termite company, have their buddies do the termite, get all the work done, give you the certification, and expect you to accept their termite report, right? And then, whatever else, so the reports that they offer. I mean, half of the transactions done by their, not a non-biased third party, it's their guys.
Yeah,
So, I don't know. That's kind of bizarre.
it is. We've caught them in a couple of things. Maxim, I haven't seen Maxim for a while. Maybe they finally just slithered away someplace, but I remember Kim had a sale one time, and as it turned out, there was a lot of damage to a floor. And she had one of those things that they would never ever take care of anything. They did take care of that. Yeah. She had to press them, but they did. Okay. Okay. It is saying that it's talking about the lead-based paint, and it's talking about time periods. Once those disclosures have been signed by the buyer, if anything happens to that property later on, then there has to be an addendum to state what the new issue is. As an example, everything was done on the 2nd of June, and seller signs it, buyer signs, and then on the 10th of June, there is a pipe that breaks and there's a lot of water damage, and the insurance company comes and repairs drywall and blah, 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 all of that stuff. We have to amend our reports and make sure that the buyer gets a copy of that report. And at the time that we issue that to the buyer, that opens up that rescission period for them again. So it's very important that we understand these things and that we follow through, because things happen all the time. There's a small fire, or even something relatively simple like a broken window. Anything that happens that requires a repair or a replacement, I would let the buyer know, because if you don't, that is just exactly the time that it's going to come back up and be an issue at some point in the future. Okay, I think we'll stop there for today. That takes us through statutory disclosures, and we'll start with the natural and environmental hazards disclosures then on Thursday.